Hello everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel Java by MK. So today is going to be different topic. So I will discuss, as you can see in my screen, I will discuss a top Spring Boot interview questions. So Spring Boot, as we know, that has become an integral part of web development. Without Spring Boot, nowadays it is very difficult to create a web application with such a production level development project. So we know a lot about Spring Boot, but when it comes to interview, we have to prepare ourselves in a way where we can answer all the questions asked by the interviewer. If we miss any questions, they're not going to select us. So let's prepare in a way that even though we know all about Spring Boot, we should be able to answer all the questions asked in the interview. So let's get started with the first question that is there. What is Spring Boot and what are its advantages? So let's go. We have been using ChatGPT, you can see, to get all the important questions on Spring Boot. So let's get started with all the questions. What is Spring Boot? What are its advantages? How does Spring Boot differ from Spring Framework? What are starters in Spring Boot? So with the first problem, you can see what is Spring Boot. So Spring Boot is a Java framework with which provides uh, auto and configuration with embedded Tomcat and provides production ready web application. How does Spring Boot differ from Spring Framework? Spring Boot is, as I said, is comes with auto configuration. On the other hand, Spring Framework, we have to configure on our own, and Tomcat is embedded in Spring Boot, but Tomcat is not embedded in Spring Framework. What are starters in Spring Boot? Actuators are what is the Spring Boot auto configuration? So how do you run a Spring Boot application? We run in var or jar format. What is the role of Spring Boot application notation? It is with enable MVC. Then it has component scan. Then auto configuration is there. How do you externalize the configuration of Spring Boot? We use application properties or application.yml. We implement security in Spring Boot using JWT Java just Java Web Token or Spring Security or OAuth 2. We deploy Spring Boot application using either var or jar. We use REST controller annotation and request mapping to uh, create a RESTful web service. REST controller to make our application RESTful best. We use REST controller. It comes with controller as well as response body. We use controller advice and exception handler annotation to handle exception in Spring Boot REST API. How do you configure data sources in Spring Boot? So we will see this. What is the purpose of the configuration properties annotation? Configuration properties, if we want to uh, externalize up the properties that we have in application YML file into the class, then we use. How do you implement caching in Spring Boot? We have some annotation for that. We will see that. What do you create and configure a custom starter in Spring Boot? How do you test a Spring Boot application? We use as hide the rate Spring Boot test. How do you configure login in Spring Boot? What are the ways to secure REST API? We use pre-authorize annotation, multi-part file to uploads in Spring Boot. How do you schedule task in Spring Boot? What is the purpose of profile annotation? How do you configure multiple data sources in Spring Boot? We use qualifier. What are the different ways to deploy Spring Boot application to a cloud platform? So let's go to the solution now. It's easy to. So Spring Boot, a framework that simplifies the development and deployment of Spring application by providing default and auto configuration. Spring Boot is built on top of Spring framework and provides simplified configuration, whereas Spring is more general purpose framework that requires more manual configuration. Pre-configured sets of dependencies that simplify dependency management in Spring Boot projects. Auto-config Spring Boot features that automatically configures beans based on the dependency and properties present in the project. Use the Spring application.run method in the main class or build and run the packaged application using java-jar. A convenience annotation that combines configuration, enable auto configuration and component scan. Externalizing use application.properties files into command. Spring Boot features that provide monitoring and management endpoints for the application. Using security, using Spring security configuration, configuring authentication authorization as needed. Flyway or Liquibase to manage database schema changes. Deploy as a standalone jar var. I have said already. RESTful REST controller and request memory. Okay, data controller. Okay, data source configuration use application properties or application YAML. Annotation used to bind properties to a configuration class. Enable caching annotation, cacheable, cache put, and cache event annotation. Create a model with auto configuration required dependencies and include in other projects. Use Spring Boot test for integration testing for mock bean to mock beans. Used in testing to create and inject a mock instance of a bean. Configuration log configure logging levels and destination or using a logging framework configuration. Use security Spring security like with JWT OAuth2 or basic authentication. Multi-part file is in a controller method to handle file upload. Use a consistent error response structure, validate input and handle exception gracefully. Enable task scheduling, enable scheduling and scheduled annotation for scheduling. Used to define basic beans that should be activated only in specific profiles. Configure multiple data sources and use qualifier to distinguish between them. Use platform to, specific tools and services for deployment on like AWS, Azure or GCP. Configure session settings in or use Spring Session for distributed sessions. A tool for managing and configuring monitoring Spring Boot application. Configure server properties and application properties or implement web server factory customizer. Used to declare transactional boundaries at the method or class level. Internalizations. I18N use message source and local specific message properties files. Value versus configuration properties. Value for individual values. Configuration properties or binding a whole configuration class. Integrate message broker. Integrate with RabbitMQ or Kafka using Spring Boot starter and configure connection settings. Large application structure. Use a modular approach, separate concern and follow best practice. Use URI versioning, parameter versioning or header versioning to manage API. Use to conditionally create beans based on certain criteria. Configure codes globally in WebMVC configurer or use cross origin rotation.